June 6, 1944. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Normandy countryside. A hazy pall of smoke clung to the earth, obscuring the ravaged hedgerows. In the distance, a solitary church bell chimed once, then fell into an unnerving silence. Within the confined metallic womb of a Sherman tank, Private Joe Johnson, just 22 years of age, felt a trickle of sweat making its way down his spine. The air inside was thick with the acrid scent of oil, hot metal, and palpable dread. His knuckles were white where they gripped the gear shift. His ears still throbbed from the jarring concussions of a near-fatal impact. A projectile had detonated less than 10 feet away, showering their vehicle with earth and shrapnel. His crew was shouting, a frantic chorus of alarm. Their main gun was jammed. The primary access hatch refused to budge, and now, from the tree line ahead, a sound emerged, an unmistakable growl, deep, powerful, and foreboding. A Tiger tank. The very ground beneath them seemed to tremble with the ponderous rotation of its tracks. Joe heard Ellis, their gunner, his voice strained. "We can't outmaneuver it." Mitch, the loader, cursed under his breath, pounding on the side panel, desperately trying to dislodge the obstruction in the breach. The tank commander, his face a mask of apprehension, had fallen silent, his gaze fixed wide-eyed on the mist ahead. Somewhere within that swirling haze, the Tiger was lining up its shot. Every instinct screamed at Joe to advance, to charge or retreat, to break free from this trap. But Joe did the unthinkable. He engaged reverse gear. Without a word, he slammed the lever backward, and the Sherman lurched violently. Its treads churned and spun, tearing up soil and roots as the tank began its backward plunge into the obscuring fog. The crew cried out, not in pain, but in utter disbelief. "Are you out of your mind?" Joe offered no reply. He didn't even flinch. His eyes scanned the side mirrors, meticulously registering every undulation of the terrain, every fleeting shadow. And just beyond the veil of smoke, the Tiger advanced, slow, deliberate, seemingly impervious. What Joe did next would alter the course of events, for in the ensuing 10 minutes, relying solely on instinct, raw courage, and a strategy utterly absent from any military manual, he would annihilate not one, but two of Hitler's most dreaded armored vehicles, all while retreating. And by the time it was over, he would never again drive forward in battle. The man who mastered retreat. Before the brutal realities of Normandy, before the terrifying specter of the Tigers, before the war transformed verdant fields into infernos, Joe Johnson was simply a farm boy from Seward County, Nebraska. He had learned the intricacies of machinery from his father, understanding the rhythm of engines and the bearing of weight on wheels. He could maneuver a John Deere tractor through a bustling chicken coop without disturbing a single bucket. But that was the world of dirt roads and diesel, not the grim theater of war. When Joe enlisted in the summer of 1942, he bore little resemblance to a soldier. He was tall, but slender, quiet, his voice rarely raised. He abstained from excessive drinking and gambling. During basic training, his fellow recruits dubbed him Slowpoke Joe. Later, their jest evolved into something more pointed, Backtrack Joe. This moniker stemmed from his peculiar habit of reversing his tank in every drill, every simulated engagement, every live fire exercise. The drill sergeants were exasperated. "Johnson, you going to win the war driving backwards?" one bellowed during training in Louisiana. Joe remained unyielding, persisting in his unusual maneuver. He would back out of simulated ambushes, retreat through narrow woodland passages, always possessing an uncanny awareness of his surroundings. While others practiced aggressive forward assaults, Joe would slip away during meal breaks to reverse his Sherman down gravel tracks, honing his ability to read the landscape through his mirrors, learning to sense the 48,000 pounds of metal shifting in reverse. To most of his unit, this appeared to be fear. And perhaps, to some degree, it was. Joe was not without apprehension. He wasn't reckless. He harbored no desire for glory, nor did he aspire to be the soldier posing triumphantly atop a vanquished panzer for the cameras. His sole ambition was to bring his entire crew home, safe and sound. Consequently, he delved into the study of not only battlefield tactics, but also human psychology, German armored doctrine, and field repair manuals. He committed to memory the vulnerabilities of the Tiger tank, its rear armor, the turret ring, the engine deck, contemplating these aspects ceaselessly, even in his sleep. He never spoke of his meticulous preparations, simply filing away the information like a mechanic meticulously documenting the issues of a faulty transmission. However, none of this registered with his comrades. They perceived only hesitation, a reluctance to charge headlong, an absence of heroic bravado. And in the crucible of war, hesitation too often masqueraded as cowardice. Thus, Joe learned to endure their taunts. He allowed them to call him Backtrack Joe. He tolerated their laughter when he reversed through a field during training to evade a mock ambush. He heard their whispers that he would be the first to falter when the real bullets began to fly. What they failed to comprehend was this: Joe Johnson did not fear the enemy. He feared making a critical error that would cost his men their lives. And that particular fear, a constructive one, instilled in him caution, precision, and relentless determination, for he knew the Tigers were coming. And when they did, he would already be facing the correct direction. Ambush in the fog, the Tiger emerges. By the third day following the Normandy landings, the terrain had dramatically transformed from sandy beaches to a labyrinth of hedgerows and deadly traps. The French countryside offered little respite for armored vehicles. The narrow lanes were bordered by ancient stone walls, and the fields were encircled by dense thickets, so impenetrable they might as well have been solid concrete. Joe's detachment, comprising 4 Sherman tanks and a single half-track, had advanced too far. Radio communication with headquarters had been lost 2 hours prior. Their objective was to rendezvous with a Canadian column north of Carentan, but the road had vanished behind a collapsed barn. Now, they were positioned in a clearing at the edge of a field, partially obscured by smoke, with visibility limited to a mere 50 feet in any direction. Mitch, the loader, scanned the treetops. "This feels wrong," he muttered. Joe offered no response. He had already silenced the engine. The abrupt quiet unsettled the crew. The birds had ceased their chirping. Even the incessant buzzing of flies had disappeared. Then, a sound arose, low, rhythmic, mechanical, a pulse of metal striking metal, deep and steady, akin to a colossal sledgehammer echoing from beneath the earth. It was not an engine from their own forces. Joe stiffened. He recognized that sound. Every tanker did. A Tiger. The German Panzerkampfwagen 6, more commonly known as the Tiger, was the most feared tank in all of Europe. Weighing over 57 tons, armed with a formidable 88mm gun, and protected by armor that could shrug off all but direct air attack, the Tiger transcended its mechanical nature. It was a legend, a phantom, the embodiment of terror that could reduce seasoned tank crews to silent, prey-like men. The initial shell struck before they even registered its approach. The Sherman to their left, designated Red 5, erupted in a blinding inferno of fire and steel. One moment it was there, the next, it was gone, ripped asunder from its flank. The occupants within had no chance. Joe's crew instinctively ducked as the shockwave slammed against their own hull. Ellis, the gunner, uttered a low curse. "That wasn't artillery. That was direct fire." "Tiger?" Mitch inquired. Joe didn't need to confirm. The answer was glaringly apparent. He peered through the periscope, his gaze sweeping the tree line. And then he saw it, barely discernible in the mist, the long barrel of a gun slowly traversing from left to right. Behind it, the silhouette of an armored behemoth, crouched low like a predator, poised to strike. The German tank was actively hunting them. Their own main gun was still recovering from the jarring impact. The turret rotated sluggishly. The loader had yet to rearm the weapon. They had perhaps 20 seconds, or even less, before the next projectile arrived. Mitch shouted, "We can't stay here, Joe. Move forward now." But Joe remained motionless. His eyes shifted from the periscope to the terrain behind them. A gentle slope, muddy and uneven, but blessedly open. It led into a dense patch of trees, not substantial, but potentially enough to buy them crucial time. The Tiger began to pivot. Joe made his decision. He grasped the gear lever and forcefully engaged reverse, the first reverse kill. The Sherman lurched backward, its tracks digging into the sodden slope. The interior of the tank was filled with the deafening roar of the engine and the discordant clatter of loose fittings. The crew was violently thrown against their seats, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of alarm. "Joe, what in the devil are you doing?" Mitch yelled. "Hold on," Joe replied, his voice calm but resolute. "We're not retreating. We're repositioning." Repositioning in reverse. No one had the luxury of argument. Another German shell impacted the earth directly in front of them, showering their periscope with dirt. The tank shuddered violently. The sound was like the earth itself cracking open under the force of thunder. The blast wave struck Joe's chest with the force of a hammer, yet he maintained a firm grip on the controls. He could feel the contours of the terrain through the vibrations resonating beneath his boots. The mud was thick, inconsistent, but it sloped downward just enough to provide a modicum of concealment. He guided the tank backward through the swirling smoke and dust, angling slightly so that the wrecked Red 5 provided a screen for their right flank. The Tiger fired again. The projectile tore through the very space their tank had occupied mere seconds earlier. The impact flung fragments of earth and metal through the air. Inside, Ellis whispered, "If we'd stayed, we'd be..." He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Joe remained silent, his concentration absolute. The view through the periscope was a scene of utter chaos. Trees, smoke, flashes of light, then darkness. But Joe wasn't merely observing what lay ahead. He was anticipating what the Tiger driver was experiencing. Confusion, erratic movement, targets flickering in the haze, a Sherman that defied all expected behavior. He recalled a piece of advice his father had given him while teaching him to operate their old farm tractor. "The trick to reversing," he'd said, "isn't just looking backward. It's knowing precisely where you came from." Those words now echoed in his mind with the steady rhythm of a heartbeat. Joe yanked the lever again, propelling the Sherman further into the fog. He executed a sharp left turn, using the smoldering carcass of Red 5 as temporary cover. The enemy crew, presuming they had neutralized the last threat, began a slow, confident advance, the measured pace of predators, certain of their kill. "Loader," Joe commanded crisply. "High explosive loaded," Mitch responded, slamming the round into the breech. "Forget high explosive," Joe instructed. "Armor piercing next." Mitch paused for a fraction of a second, then nodded. "Copy that." The Tiger reappeared, a monstrous silhouette emerging from the dissipating smoke. Its 88mm gun moved with an almost surgical precision. Every action was deliberate, measured, menacing. Joe could see the commander's cupola rotating, scanning for any signs of survivors. For a fleeting moment, both machines confronted each other, hunter and hunted. Yet, only one was moving backward. Joe released the clutch, and the Sherman jolted forward. The crew braced themselves as they accelerated backward, weaving between the smoking craters. Ellis kept his hands steady on the turret traverse controls, guided by Joe's unspoken direction. "Joe, I can't get a clean shot from this angle." "You will. Just trust me." He drove by feel, sensing the incline beneath them. Mud clung tenaciously to the treads. The pungent odor of diesel fuel permeated the air. Every bump sent a jolt through the hull. The engine groaned like a creature in immense distress. Still, Joe maintained an unwavering steadiness. His objective was to lure the tiger, to foster the illusion that the Americans were in full retreat. Through the mirror, he observed its relentless approach. That hulking shape crawled forward, its turret rotating to track their movement. Joe could almost visualize the German gunner smirking behind his sights. "Come on," Joe whispered. "Follow me." The tiger fired. The projectile whistled past their vehicle, striking the embankment behind them and erupting in a blinding cloud of dirt and flame. The heat washed over the Sherman's rear armor. The crew coughed, their lungs filled with smoke seeping through the vents. "That was close," Mitch muttered. Joe offered no reply. He reversed with greater force, increasing their speed, pushing the gears to their audible limit. Then, at the very last conceivable moment, he sharply yanked the controls, angling the tank violently down a narrow embankment. The Tiger followed precisely as he had anticipated. The German tank lumbered forward onto the slope, its gun depressed, attempting to maintain a clear line of sight. In doing so, however, it exposed its most vulnerable point, the underside of its rear hull. Joe recognized it instantly. "Stop!" he shouted. The Sherman halted with a screech of its tracks. Mud splattered against the hull. "Turret at 9 o'clock. Armor-piercing loaded." "Loaded," Ellis confirmed, already swinging the gun into position. Joe exhaled slowly. "Take the shot." The cannon roared, its recoil causing the entire tank to shudder. Smoke instantly filled the interior, rendering visibility zero. For a tense second, no one could see. Then, through the dissipating haze, a brilliant orange bloom erupted from the Tiger's rear. A direct hit. The German tank convulsed, then exploded again as its ammunition detonated. The blast rippled through the forest like a thunderclap, scattering birds and dislodging leaves in every direction. Shards of armor rained down, hissing as they struck the damp earth. Inside Joe's tank, an unnerving silence descended. The crew exchanged wide-eyed glances, their mouths agape. "Did we just—" Mitch stammered. "Yeah," Ellis said softly. "We did." Joe offered no smile. He simply watched the inferno consuming the Tiger. The flickering firelight cast dancing shadows across his face, reflecting in his eyes like tiny, captured suns. "Reload," he commanded quietly. "We're not finished yet." The radio crackled with static. Then a faint, broken voice emerged. "Unit Bravo, report. We're pinned down. Tiger in the tree line." Joe grabbed the microphone. "One Tiger down, moving to support." The voice hesitated. "Say again. You destroyed a Tiger?" Joe did not repeat himself. He simply engaged the gears. As they backed away through the lingering smoke, the crew finally began to exhale. Mitch let out a nervous laugh, shaking his head. "Backtrack, Joe. Holy hell, man. You're really going to fight the Nazis in reverse." Ellis grinned, wiping sweat from his brow. "I'll drink to that when we get out of here." Joe remained silent, his focus unwavering, fixed on the path ahead, or rather, behind. The battlefield they were leaving was alive with fire and the cacophony of battle. The enemy would undoubtedly regroup quickly. The element of surprise was already dissipating. But in that brief window, something fundamental had shifted. The Tiger, the terrifying symbol of German armored might, was no longer invincible. It could be defeated. It could burn. The radio continued to buzz with voices shouting coordinates, issuing orders, a symphony of chaos. Joe paid little attention. His mind was already calculating. The reverse tactic had proven effective once, but the enemy would adapt. He needed to think faster, drive more strategically, exploit every advantage the terrain offered. Mitch studied him, observing the thoughtful expression on Joe's face. "You knew that would work, didn't you?" Joe shrugged slightly. "Didn't know. Just figured it might." "That's insane." Maybe, but it's better than dying in a straight line. Ellis chuckled, still visibly shaken. You know, Joe, when you said we'd be the only ones to win a battle going backward, I thought you were joking. I never joke about survival, Joe replied. The distant rumble of gunfire echoed through the hedgerows. The sharp scent of burning fuel and scorched earth filled the air. Somewhere, another explosion reverberated. The second tiger, still out there, still hunting. Joe tightened his grip on the controls. Let's move, he said. We've got work to do. As the Sherman continued its backward journey into the mist, the crew found a rhythm in the engine's hum, the steady beat of metal and unwavering courage. They were unaware that this was merely the beginning. In less than 20 minutes, Joe Johnston's audacious reverse strategy would transform into a legend whispered throughout every Allied encampment in Normandy. And though the man himself harbored no illusions about glory, destiny had already etched his name for something far greater. A single act of defiance that would resonate long after the smoke had cleared. Because in war, true courage doesn't always charge forward. Sometimes, it drives in reverse. The Reverser, a legend is born. News of the tiger's destruction spread with astonishing speed, outpacing the lingering smoke. Joe, though not one for extensive radio chatter, found his actions speaking for themselves. A Sherman tank had single-handedly eliminated a tiger while retreating. This improbable detail became the refrain, often delivered with a hint of disbelief, almost like a punchline. Did you hear? Some guy backed right into a tiger and blew it to bits. By nightfall, the nickname had taken hold. The Reverser. Joe, however, remained indifferent. He wasn't seeking accolades or monikers. His thoughts were consumed by the presence of the second tiger. They had withdrawn to a temporary regroup point, nestled within a hollowed-out hedgerow, concealed beneath the dense canopy of trees. One tank lost, 2 others sustaining damage. Their commanding officer, Lieutenant Keating, arrived in a jeep caked in mud, demanding a full debriefing. "You actually took out a tiger?" he inquired of Joe, his voice laced with incredulity. "Yes, sir," Joe responded simply. "With what?" "A lucky shot." "No, sir," Joe corrected. "With positioning." Keating studied him, attempting to gauge the young soldier. Joe defied the typical soldierly archetype. He was neither boisterous nor presumptuous. He simply stood there in his oil-stained uniform, his face streaked with ash and sweat, exuding a remarkable composure, as if he had merely completed a routine maintenance task. Keating glanced down at the map spread across the tank's front hull. "We've got another tiger stalking the valley road. Canadians are taking a beating. If you've got another one of those positions in mind, now's the time." Joe leaned in, his gaze intent on the map, analyzing it with the strategic foresight of a grandmaster. "There's a shallow ridge here," he stated, indicating a point with a grease-blackened finger. "If we loop through this orchard, we can reverse down the far side and establish a defensive line. It's the only way we'll get another shot at its rear." Keating raised an eyebrow. "You're serious? You want to lead with your tail?" Joe met his gaze directly, unwavering. "That's where the advantage lies." The lieutenant stepped back, a moment of contemplation passing in silence. Then, he nodded once. "You've got 10 minutes. Joe returned to his crew. "They're already prepping the tank," Mitch informed him. "Armor-piercing loaded. Turret recalibrated," Ellis added. "Still a bit off-center, but she'll hold." Joe climbed into the driver's seat. The controls were slick with grime. His hands were cracked and trembling, but his voice remained steady. "We're going to flank from behind," he instructed them. "We'll use the orchard for cover. Once we clear the ridge, we'll reverse down the slope slowly. I want that tiger to believe we're just another straggler running scared." Ellis let out a dry chuckle. You want us to look like cowards so we can act like killers? Something like that. They rolled out, their engines at a low rumble, the treads muffled by the soft earth. The orchard loomed ahead, a dense expanse of gnarled apple trees, their leaves scorched by artillery fire, their fruit blackened on the branches. Wisps of smoke drifted between the trunks like spectral curtains. The Sherman eased into position. Joe expertly backed it down the ridge, his eyes darting between the mirrors and the feel of the slope beneath them. Beyond the ridge lay the valley road, and somewhere beyond that, the second Tiger. Through the periscope, they saw it. The immense silhouette of another German tank, angled slightly to the left. Its main gun pointed uphill towards a Canadian convoy stalled in a desperate retreat. They could hear the distant, sporadic rattle of gunfire. Visible tracer rounds sliced through the mist. The Tiger held the advantage, seemingly untouched, unstoppable, until now. Joe continued to reverse, his movements slow and controlled, navigating each foot of terrain with deliberate precision. The objective wasn't merely to move, it was to appear non-threatening, to project an image of defeat and panic, to behave like prey. Almost there, Joe murmured. Ellis had the turret aligned. Mitch stood ready with the next round. Every mechanism within the tank was taut with anticipation. And then, Joe saw it. The precise moment, the critical second, when the Tiger pivoted slightly to adjust its aim. Its rear armor flashed into view as if marked by an invisible target. "Fire," Joe commanded. The cannon roared, its discharge splitting the air like a thunderous whip crack. A breathless pause ensued. Then, a blossoming inferno erupted on the Tiger's rear. A direct hit. The round pierced the grated armor above the engine deck, detonating with explosive force. Yet the Tiger did not immediately cease its function. The beast shuddered, turned, wounded but not incapacitated. Its turret began to swing around, a slow, menacing, and terrifyingly deliberate motion. Inside Joe's tank, an unspoken tension filled the air. "Reload! Armor piercing!" Joe barked. "Already on it." Mitch slammed another shell into the breach, his hands blistered from the heat. The turret groaned, its hydraulics sluggish from dust and exertion as Ellis wrestled with the traverse crank. The Tiger, now fully aware of the threat behind it, completed its turn. The German crew realized they were no longer pursuing phantoms. They were being hunted by someone who understood their tactics. "Hold it steady," Joe whispered. The Sherman tank rested partially visible on the incline, its rear concealed by splintered tree trunks, its front illuminated by the inferno consuming a German Tiger. Suddenly, the enemy cannon discharged. A projectile whizzed past, missing by a hair's breadth, impacting a stone embankment behind them. The concussive force jolted the Sherman as if struck. Joe bit his lip, the metallic tang of blood filling his mouth. "Fire now or we're finished," Mitch bellowed. "Ellis!" Joe started to say, but Ellis didn't hesitate. The second shot erupted from their own cannon, a fleeting flash, a thunderous boom. This time the shell found its mark lower, beneath the turret, wedging itself between armor plates before detonating with the ferocity of a long-held secret. The Tiger didn't merely explode, it disintegrated. Its turret soared skyward like an abandoned cap, flames spewing from every seam. The massive vehicle tilted, crashing against the roadside. Ammunition within began to detonate in a cascade of deafening reports, painting the night momentarily blue. Inside their own Sherman, the crew sat in stunned silence. The Tiger, the dreaded legend, the monster every Allied soldier had learned to fear, was gone, reduced to smoldering wreckage. Mitch slumped against the hull, his hands trembling. "That's two damn Tigers." Ellis released a shaky laugh, followed by a cough, then simply gazed at the inferno. Joe remained silent, his gaze fixed on the flames, his expression inscrutable. Then the shockwave arrived. An unseen German artillery shell, perhaps fired blindly, perhaps a cruel twist of fate, landed less than 10 feet from their left track. The blast lifted the tank clear off its suspension. A searing wave of light, sound, and heat slammed into the crew like an impenetrable wall. The world dissolved into white. Joe's ears buzzed violently. His head struck the viewport's edge. He felt a damp warmth spread across his ribs, not heat, but blood. Ellis's shouts were muffled, unintelligible. His vision swam. Someone was pulling at his arm. The tank hissed, sparks flying. Mitch's voice, distorted by static, crackled over the radio. Joe blinked, twice, then looked down. A jagged piece of shrapnel was lodged deep in his side, just below his vest. Dark blood seeped through his uniform. It didn't sting, not yet. It felt cold. He leaned back into his seat, hands still gripping the controls. Outside, the Tiger continued to burn, its fiery corpse casting an orange and black glow on the fog. Beyond it, the Canadian convoy, bruised but intact, began to resume its movement. They were safe now, because of him. Ellis knelt beside him. Joe, you're hurt. Say something." Joe blinked, a faint smile touching his lips. "Tell command. Objective secured." Mitch's voice wavered. "We need a medic. Now." "No time," Joe murmured. He slowly turned his head, peering through the small rearview mirror. Smoke, fire, mud, a trail of destruction stretching back across the ridge, through the orchard, to the first Tiger. Everything they had accomplished, everything he had navigated backward. Joe let out a soft, weak chuckle. "Guess I really did fight the Nazis in reverse." His eyes began to drift shut. Ellis grasped his shoulder. "Hey, no, stay with me. You hear me? You're not going out like this." But Joe was already drifting. The roar of engines faded, the fire receded. He saw the vast wheat fields of Nebraska, his father's hands on a tractor's wheel, the scent of diesel, the rich smell of freshly turned earth. He whispered his final words. "Tell my mom. I didn't back down. I backed them up." Then, silence. A hero does not simply return. When the radio finally fell silent, the surrounding war did not abate. Artillery still rumbled in the distance beyond the valley. Smoke drifted across the ridgeline like a burial shroud. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burnt metal and gasoline, an aroma that would forever cling to the skin. The Sherman sat partially submerged in mud, its armor scarred and pitted, its barrel still warm from its final discharge. The crew had ceased their frantic calls. Nothing more remained to be said. Ellis partially emerged from the hatch, gasping for air. He could hear distant cheers. Canadian troops, realizing the Tigers were eliminated and the route was clear. Yet, inside the tank, victory felt like an empty shell. The world outside was moving forward, but Joe was not. Mitch sat beside him, pressing a blood-soaked rag against Joe's wound, his own hands slick with the lifeblood. "Stay with me, Joe. Hey, come on. You hear me? We made it." Joe's eyelids fluttered open. His voice, rough with dust and pain, was a mere whisper. "Did we? Did they get through?" "Yes," Mitch replied quickly. "They're safe. You did it." A slow breath escaped Joe's chest, a sound caught between a sigh and a laugh. "Good," he breathed. For a few moments, the three men remained in the quiet stillness. No orders, no radio transmissions, only the faint hum of a failing engine. Outside, the fog glowed with the faint orange light of the burning Tiger, casting long, wavering shadows within the tank. Joe's hand slipped from the control lever, brushing against the cold steel floor. He could feel its faint vibration, the machine's heart still beating as his own faltered. He looked at Mitch and Ellis, his eyes glassy but clear enough to see their faces. "Don't," he murmured. "Don't be scared to back up. Sometimes that's the only way forward." Mitch swallowed hard. "Don't talk like that." But Joe offered a faint smile. a gentle, calm expression that suggested acceptance. He tilted his head back, gazing through the periscope's narrow slit. Above the drifting smoke, he glimpsed a patch of open sky, pale blue, boundless. It reminded him of home, Nebraska in summer. The scent of diesel from the old tractor, his mother's hands dusted with flour, the chirping of crickets at dusk. For a single heartbeat, he wasn't in France, he was home. The battlefield's din receded, becoming a quiet hum like the slow winding down of gears. His breathing grew shallow. The blood on his chest was no longer warm. His fingers twitched once, as if attempting one last gear shift. Then, his hand lay still. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. For a considerable time, the crew remained motionless. The only sound was the wind whispering through the shattered trees. Ellis eventually lowered his head. Mitch stared at the floor, his lips trembling. Outside, the sun began to pierce the fog, its light spilling across the valley, illuminating the charred remains of the Tigers, the torn earth, and the battered Sherman that had refused to surrender. Canadian medics arrived minutes later. They found 2 deeply shaken soldiers and 1 fallen driver. Joe was covered with a tarp, his name scrawled on the tank's side in chalk. Private Joseph R. Johnson, killed in action. Later, the Canadians would speak of the bravery they witnessed that day, though they struggled to articulate it. How does one explain a man who confronted the war's most formidable tank by driving backward? That night, as the smoke dissipated and silence reclaimed Normandy, Ellis penned a single line in his notebook, words destined for solitary reading years later. He never looked like a hero. He just refused to let us die. He didn't retreat. He reversed the odds. The cost of a single life. Joe was laid to rest 2 weeks later beneath a small apple tree near Common, his grave marked by a simple wooden cross with a helmet resting at its base. The Canadians insisted on conducting the ceremony. His own unit was too deep within enemy lines to return. No eulogy was delivered. There were no journalists, no grand military honors, only the soft murmur of the wind in the orchard and the quiet scrape of shovels against the earth. Yet, word of his actions spread like wildfire. They said he had vanquished 2 Tigers in under 10 minutes. They claimed he had driven backward the entire engagement. They asserted he had saved 37 lives, clearing a path that transformed a faltering retreat into a decisive counteroffensive. Initially, officers dismissed these accounts as mere rumor until they examined the wreckage, spoke with the surviving crew, and discovered the incinerated body of a Tiger tank commander, his field map displaying Allied retreat lines precisely where Joe had interdicted them. Back home, the tale found its way into the local newspaper in Seward County, Nebraska. The headline proclaimed, "Local farm boy turns the tide in France." His mother wept upon reading it, unaware that the official telegram had yet to arrive. The War Department eventually verified his actions, posthumously awarding him the Silver Star. The citation lauded his extraordinary tactical improvisation under direct enemy fire. However, the men who served alongside him referred to it not as tactics, but as sheer grit. In the ensuing months, crews across the front lines began to practice what they jokingly termed reverser drills, simulating backward retreats, employing smoke for concealment, and targeting Tiger vulnerabilities from unconventional vectors. Though Joe's name was absent from official training manuals, among tank crews, his name became synonymous with a specific mindset: bold, unconventional, desperate, yet calculated. The kind of thinking that preserves lives. When the war concluded, a contingent of soldiers returned to that very ridge and replaced Joe's wooden cross with a granite marker. Etched into the stone were just 3 lines. Private Joseph R. Johnson. He did not retreat. He reversed the odds. The field where he perished eventually grew quiet once more, blanketed by wildflowers and scattered fragments of rusted metal. But once each year, on the anniversary of the Normandy breakout, a Canadian veteran would visit. He would bring a small flask of bourbon, placing it on the stone, and then sit in silent contemplation, for he understood what the official reports omitted. Joe hadn't merely halted a tiger, he had vanquished the very essence of fear. Would you dare to reverse? Most wartime narratives conclude with accolades, commemorations, or celebratory parades. But this account concludes on a Normandy slope, where a mud-caked Sherman continues to rust beneath the weeds, its treads frozen, pointing not towards glory, but away from it. Backwards. Joe Johnson left no memoirs. He never returned home to recount his story. He left behind no cherished letters, no stirring speeches, no pronouncements from the battlefield. What he left was a trail of decisions no one else dared to make, a strategy unknown to any manual, a singular moment where fear commanded retreat, and instead he stood his ground by turning around. It was audacious, perhaps even suicidal, but it proved effective. Not through luck, not through superior might, but because he perceived what others overlooked, that sometimes the most courageous act a man can perform is not to charge forward. Sometimes heroism manifests as the grinding of gears in reverse. Sometimes saving 37 lives bears no resemblance to a cinematic charge, and occasionally the comrade you jested with during training becomes the name you whisper when darkness engulfs all. So, consider this question. In a world that champions forward momentum, would you dare to pause? Would you dare to turn around? Not out of apprehension, but because it's the sole path to safeguarding those behind you. Because courage isn't always a step ahead. Sometimes it's knowing precisely when to take one step back. What left the greatest impression on you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And never forget, Joe the Reverser.